Hey there, what's up everyone? Mr. Lewis here, ready to continue with Unit 5 in AP HuG today by covering Sections 5.3 and 5.4. Section 5.3 is language dialect, and it gets into the different ways that the same language can be used by different people within a country or around the world. So English, for example, is the most commonly spoken language in the United States, and it's also the most commonly spoken language throughout the world. But in the United States and around the world, we find very different versions, very different forms of the English language. Sometimes, like in the United States, that's based on regional distinctions and cultural interpretations and uses of that language. Around the world, it's because of the diffusion of the English language into other cultures that were already speaking indigenous languages or native languages and then took on English as a second language, a third language. And so, of course, that's going to lead to all these different dialects as well. And then in section 5.4, we're going to take a closer look at language hearths and some of the main origins of the most predominant languages used around the world today. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Okay, section 5.3, language dialects. So a dialect is a different version, a different form of the same language. Just because two people are speaking the same language doesn't really mean they're speaking the same language. Dialect could encompass everything from accent to pronunciation to word choice. There are many different aspects of dialect that we see around the country or around the world. And they're very important because they still represent in many ways these regional distinctions that actually end up contributing to our sense of cultural identity. So people arguing over whether to call something a soda or a pop, or as they would call it in the South, just Coke, even though they might not mean Coca-Cola, or if we just call it a fizzy drink, these debates get very emotional because people are tied to these regional distinctions. It shows you how important language, and within that, simple word choice and dialect can mean to people. So this video is great. If you want to take a look at this, I'm not going to show you the whole thing now and spend our time in the video lecture doing that. But this video goes through 50 different people who live in each of the 50 states, and they kind of discuss their accents. And what's funny is the more the accent sounds like your particular accent, the less likely you are to hear it, right? The more different an accent is to your own, then it's going to start to stand out. But as we think about and question why different dialects or accents have developed throughout time, much of this actually goes back to Creole languages. So here's how a Creole language is developed. If somebody moves into an area, a culture comes into communication with another culture, they have to have some way to communicate. Well, at first, it's very rudimentary, and it's just the basics so that two people can effectively or even ineffectively communicate with one another. This is what's called a pidgin language, not like the bird. Pidgin like P-I-D-G-I-N, and then over time that pidgin language develops and it becomes a little smoother and more organized and more official, and eventually generations later people are actually learning as children that pidgin language as their first language. It's a mashup, it's a combination of two languages that came together because of different cultures coming into contact with one another. This is what we call a Creole language, and that can very much influence accents, pronunciation, word choice. So one of the biggest English-based Creole languages in the Americas is Jamaican Creole. And if you've ever heard the Jamaican English Creole language, you have likely heard those variations in accent, pronunciation, and word choice. And so that's, in many cases, how dialects are actually formed. It can also be simply a result of non-native speakers of a language adjusting to that language. So if you had spoken a language your whole life and then you pick up a new one, as many of you are currently going through as freshman students, you'll find that your dialect is going to be very different. So I took German in high school. If I went to Germany and tried to speak German, they would notice that my accent is off. They would notice that my dialect doesn't really sound like a native German speaker, right? So our language history also has a major influence on the dialect or the accent that we put into the language that we're learning. So, for example, in India, okay, India has one of the largest English-speaking populations in the world. It's not their first language for most people. Okay, most people are speaking Hindi as their first language in India, but because of the history of the British Empire colonizing India, many people in India speak English quite well. It's a different dialect, it's a different accent, it's a different form of the English language, but as a result, there are many American companies that actually outsource jobs, many customer service jobs and things like that, to India because people there speak English quite well. And for the American companies, they can pay less for a worker to do that job in India than they would in America because there are so many people in India, there's a lot of poverty, and so the minimum wage is a lot lower. But the main attraction is the fact that so many different people speak that English language so well, right? And there are many countries, not just India, there are many countries in which this type of outsourcing takes place because of the ability of many people in those areas to speak the English language so well. So there's a lot of history tied up in this thing called dialect and the diffusion of language. This is an interesting video. If you want to take a look, it's simply for fun. It has nothing to do with what you'll be tested over, but it's going to give you a bunch of different people from around the world speaking English, and then you get a little bit of time to kind of guess to yourself what type of accent is that. So there are Australians speaking English, there are Americans speaking English, different regions of the United States are represented. There are English speaking English, or British, in other words, speaking English. There are Scottish citizens, Irish citizens, Indian citizens, all these different people from around the world who you get to hear speak a little bit of English and then try to guess where you think they might be from. And it's kind of a fun way to analyze dialect and accent and see if you can figure out where that particular English dialect is coming from, and see if you are a master of the English language there, or listening to it anyway. Finally, today, our final section, 5.4, language hearths. And remember, a hearth is simply where a language or anything begins. And you can see on this map here, not necessarily the origins of the languages, but the most commonly spoken languages around the world today in each country. And so over in the West, we see a lot of English. In Canada, the United States. This blue here is French, Eastern Canada. We have a lot of French speakers because the French colonized that region of Canada. And so much of this is due to colonization over history, right? The diffusion from colonization and exploration over time. These red areas, Spanish. This orange, Portuguese. Remember that Brazil, or Eastern South America, was colonized by the Portuguese Empire. And so Portuguese is still the dominant language in Brazil today. The rest of South America, mostly Spanish, but also some French there in the northern parts of South America. The French were very active colonially in that region and also in the Caribbean. Here in Africa, you can see there's two major regions. There's North Africa, that is mostly Arabic speaking, as is the Arabian Peninsula. And then in sub-Saharan Africa, there are many Indo-European languages spoken as, in some cases, official languages in those countries. And this is, again, a remnant of colonization. European colonizers who moved into not just the Americas, but sub-Saharan Africa and actually all of Africa, and took their language with them. But today, Arabic still maintains a stronghold in North Africa, whereas sub-Saharan Africa, it's split up. There are many different languages, from French to English to Spanish to Portuguese. But remember, the language family that is responsible for most of the languages spoken in sub-Saharan Africa originated in sub-Saharan Africa. It's called the Niger-Congo language family, and Swahili, which is a language within that family, is actually the lingua franca of sub-Saharan Africa. It is the go-to language for most people in sub-Saharan Africa. Many people do know English. You can see here a lot of blue because the French were very active colonizing sub-Saharan Africa, but the go-to language is Swahili. In Russia and around Russia, Russian is the dominant language. Throughout Europe, many different countries are sort of isolated, so to speak, in their use of language. So when you look at specific languages like Swedish, well, Swedish is highly concentrated in Sweden, right? There are many different languages like that we find highly concentrated in one country or another. Spanish, Spain, Portuguese, Portugal. But keep in mind, these countries are very small compared to the United States. They're more like the size of states. So many people are able to speak many of the common European languages across different borders. German, French, some Portuguese. Spanish in Southern Europe is the lingua franca. As you get to Northern Europe, it's more English and German. Finally, let's talk about Asia. Mandarin is the most commonly spoken native language in the world, and it is the most commonly spoken language of China and most of Southeast Asia. South Asia, meaning India and some other parts of South Asia, is mostly Hindi speaking. So Hindi is the third most commonly spoken language in the world, largely due to the fact that it's the most commonly spoken language in India, which has a population of well over 1 billion people. So here you see a ranking of the most used languages in the world. English and Mandarin are 1 and 2. It's very close. English being the most spoken. And then Hindi and Spanish are 3 and 4. And Hindi, just over 600 million. Spanish, just over 500 million. And then it goes French, Arabic, Bengali, and Russian. Those 4 are very close. Portuguese and Indonesian. And so many of these, such as Indonesian or Russian, are largely consolidated in terms of the speakers of these languages in one country or another, Russia or Indonesia, whereas Portuguese is kind of the exception to that rule. There are actually more Portuguese speakers outside of Portugal because Brazil's population is so large. So remember that a hearth is simply the origin, right? And we're going to look in section 5 at the diffusion of language from those origins, from those hearths. But for today, I'm going to leave you with 5 specific hearths. Moving west to east, let's look at English first. English can be traced all the way back to the Germanic branch of languages that fall within the Proto-Indo-European language family. So the Proto-Indo-European language, that is the indigenous language. That's the original, the prototype, so to speak. If you've ever heard that term prototype, like the first attempt at an invention, right? That's why we call it that, the prototype. It was the first one. Well, Proto-Indo-European was the language that became eventually German and English. But not just that, also through the Italic branch, Latin, and then Spanish. through the Indo-Iranian branch, Hindi. So all of these languages, English, Spanish, Hindi, as well as French, German, Portuguese, all of the Indo-European languages trace back to the hearth language, the Proto-Indo-European language. And that finds its origins in present-day Turkey. Now, that is a hypothesis. Okay, we know that somewhere between India and Europe, these languages developed. This language developed somewhere between India and Europe, and that's where it gets its name. Indo-European, somewhere between that stretch of land, likely in the Middle East, likely in modern-day Turkey, which separates Asia from Europe. The other two major languages I want to look at here, and these are our 5 most commonly spoken languages in the world, okay, is Arabic and Chinese. And Chinese includes Mandarin, but not just Mandarin. We're looking at all dialects of the Chinese language. This has its roots out in Asia, South Asia, where it's used predominantly today, South to Southeast Asia. And it is a Sino-Tibetan language. Sino being more East Asia, East China, and Tibetan referring to Tibet, which is near the Himalayan plateau as we get closer to India, so more Western China. So across this very large country we call China, okay, the Sino-Tibetan language found its roots. And then finally, Arabic. Arabic actually traces back to the Semitic language, which is part of the Afro-Asiatic language family. From northern Africa into Southwest Asia, Afro-Asiatic. The Proto-Semitic language branch is one of the 6 branches of the Afro-Asiatic language family. Another one of the branches is Egyptian, which is now extinct outside of minor uses in some religious practice. So you've got English, Mandarin, Spanish, Hindi, Arabic, and the one we didn't look at there was French. Out of these top 6, I mentioned those were the top 5, actually missing French there, but we can go back and actually find that French would trace back to Latin as well. French would be right next to Spanish, tracing back to this branch of the Indo-European language family. And that's why French is also considered one of the Romance languages, because it stems back to Latin, which was spoken by the Romans. All right, boom, right? I know that last thing with the Romance languages and the Romans really got you. That's a good one. I know the first time I learned that, I was like, oh, yeah, I get it now. So language can be a lot of fun. This unit is very short. It's brief. The test is only going to be 20 questions long. We're almost done with Unit 5. But there's some really interesting stuff that comes out of studying language. And some of you are already experiencing that this year, taking a foreign language for the first time and learning about some of the roots of those languages. So I hope that all contributes to our studies throughout Unit 5 and AP HuG. That's it for Sections 3 and 4. I'll see you for Sections 5 and 6 next time. Thanks for tuning in. So long, everyone.